From FingerLakes1.com, you're listening to the Debrief podcast. I'm Josh Durso, and with us today, as always, co-host Jackie Augustine. We're breaking down the latest in political headlines around the state and Finger Lakes. Jackie, it has been a while. It has been a month, I think, to our math is the best number we could come up with. It's been a while. A lot has happened. Sad, exciting, interesting, head-scratch-worthy, I guess.
Yeah. Well, before we get into that, though, I think I owe you some congratulations because I don't know anything about golf, but I hear you're a very excellent golfer and set some kind of course record. So I have not forgotten about that, and I don't want anybody else to forget about that.
I had forgotten about it.
Oh, well,
I had literally completely forgotten about it until you just mentioned it again.
Okay, well,
there's been so much news in the last 2 weeks that I completely forgot. That had happened just outside of that frame.
Right.
So I've already completely forgotten about it. But thank you. I spend a lot of time golfing when I'm not doing this whole news thing. Yeah. So it's nice. It's nice.
Yeah, it was exciting.
Okay, so we normally take a bunch of questions at the start of the show. Mm-hmm. Today we're going to actually not take as many questions. We're going to answer one question that's been sort of lingering, that I've put off a few episodes now. And then we're going to get into the topics because we have a ton of topics to actually talk about today because we have been gone for almost a month. But that question, which it's super, super interesting. Obviously, a lot of talk about plastic bags. And Allison from Lansing asked, does a plastic bag ban make sense as a piece of state legislation?
Okay.
And
does it? Is that the question?
I guess the question is, does it make sense? In other words, I think what she's asking is this something that individual counties or municipalities should be focusing on as opposed to the state?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting... In most cases, I would tend to say that the municipalities should have some say. But on the plastic bags, I think that is a state issue because, I mean, looking out at the two landfills, we've got an awful lot of plastic that's coming from other parts of the state to our backyard. So I would love to see other people care about that and want to do something about it. But I think that's the trend, the way things are going anyway. Like if you go to Aldi's, you've got to pay for your bags there if you don't bring your own bags. Mm-hmm. I think when I go to Wegmans or Tops, I see a ton of people bringing in their own bags. So I'm not opposed to it. I'm sure there are people who think it's a lot of heavy-handed government, but I think some of those same people look out their windows and, drive past the landfills after a windy day, and you'll see plastic bags are a problem.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, right? Because I was one of those people who, when I first heard about this and when I first started hearing about this debate about plastic bags, first I think that the phrase single use is super important, obviously, because they're talking about the throwaway plastic bags that people use to, maybe they're transporting leftover food or something like that. Right. They collect them, they sit under the sink for a long time, and you try to find a use for them. When I first started shopping at Aldi's, it was hard to get used to the whole concept of having to remember some sort of carrying apparatus for the stuff you're buying. But, after about 2 or 3 trips, you got used to just keeping that stuff in your car. And if you're smart, you just keep that stuff in your car because that's easier.
Yeah.
And it just kind of becomes like second nature. It's like, you don't even think about it. You're throwing the stuff in the bag. And how many times have you seen or heard or even yourself been worried or had a special request about how you want the person who's cashing you out to bag the things that are, you see people, don't put that with that. And it's like, okay, well, you can do it yourself and save everyone a lot of trouble. And I even think it might, in some way, shape, or form, maybe save those supermarkets a little bit of money.
Sure, which they could pass on to us. That'd be great.
Right. I mean, well, in theory, they're going to use it to create some sort of competitive advantage like Aldi's has.
Yeah.
So, I think it's interesting. I don't know if, getting back to the whole state aspect of it, I agree with you. I think a lot of people just sort of look at it, oh, this is another Cuomo, heavy-handed government. But there's upside. I think there's upside to something like this, and it seems much easier just to create a universal sort of rule on it across the whole state and to not have to sort of have that municipality by municipality situation where I think it could get more costly for the businesses, especially when you're talking about chains.
Right.
They have to operate without plastic in Tompkins County or with plastic in Seneca. And it just, one rule for everybody and move on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But speaking of moving on, obviously, so if you've been following the headlines, really gruesome, terrible, awful situation in Seneca Falls. A 3-year-old boy was brutally killed by his biological mother and stepfather. Both have been charged and, as of today, pled not guilty to murder, manslaughter, list of charges, 12, I believe around a dozen altogether. But interestingly enough, this situation has created a discussion around Brittanys Law. Now, we remember Brittanys Law because it's been that one of those pieces of legislation that's like hanging right on the fence. It's like almost there every year. And I think it has some sort of legislative record for being passed the most times in one chamber, but not even getting a talking in the other. But to that end, so why is this happening? This debate is happening now because we are learning that one of the individuals charged with murder has a violent past, has a violent criminal history. And proponents of Brittanys Law are saying, hey, this would be an awesome opportunity to create a registry, a violent offenders registry, right, where these individuals are identified, easily identifiable, not just by those who might be interacting on a personal level, but by the community as a whole. And it's interesting to me because I think the debate itself, it's sort of a roundabout debate. And I talked about it in my column this week. That was what I wanted to make clear, is that this situation in Seneca Falls, as sad as it is, I think almost as sad, if not even more sad, is the fact that the reaction was the system failed this little boy. We need to remove the word system and replace it.
Say, here is why we nominated the following people, right? I mean, instead of asking staff to make that argument for them, I feel like city council should have had an open discussion.
I totally understand the process and the how it all works being represented. You are really setting yourself up for a critique that is a fair critique.
Right.
And one that's almost not quite defensible.
Well, and I mean, it all could have been resolved through good communication, right? I mean, if this process had been transparent and council had said right out of the bat or right out of the box, like, this is going to be one of our most important decisions, here's how we're going to proceed, and then at every meeting had given an update, like, here's how we're proceeding, this is what we're taking into account, here's where we're leaning, this is what we're going to do next, I don't think you would have as much. I mean, you know, I'm talking to people in the city who generally maybe don't weigh in on a lot of political issues, who are just kind of rolling their eyes at this and saying, like, yeah, things never change. And I think that's not the attitude you want to breed within the community, right? You should be building trust, not
eroding it.
Well, yeah, or just keeping the status quo and making it look like it doesn't matter to you one way or the other, right? I mean, you know, being ambivalent about trust, it might even be worse than actively eroding it. At least if you're trying to erode it, at least it looks like you have a purpose. But I think that might get to the bottom of it. After attending meetings and talking to people in the community and seeing some of the stuff going on, people are complimentary of staff, but they do have a sense that this council seems aimless. Not just like, I mean, in the full meaning of that, as in there is no plan, there is no goal, and that's hard for the community to bear because we have a comprehensive plan, we have stated goals and priorities. So why aren't those reflected in the deliberations of the body that's supposed to be putting those into action? So we're just lucky because the city does have really excellent staff who get it and are doing it every day. But it would be nice if the leadership were.
And I will say, I sort of hopped the question on that one. Starting over, I think, is not really a great idea. Yeah. That's where I'll leave that one, especially when you're 5 months deep into the process. If you started over, you probably wouldn't get a decision before this year ended.
Right.
So, so this has been probably the biggest, right?
Yes.
I mean, this has been the biggest story, all sort of contingent on the whole Me Too movement, obviously sparked from it. Some really brave women came forward and talked about what they experienced at the hands of former Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. Now, though, we have an acting AG who seems super qualified, seemed to be the bipartisan choice, wasn't really a backdoor solution. She doesn't really seem to have any interest in staying in that role, which I think is kind of amusing because, if Albany were worth its salt, she would probably be thrilled with the idea of running and actually, taking that office over on a permanent basis. But it isn't, and this is pretty much what we're left with. One of the only sane people we've seen step forward, basically saying, I'll help you out for a while, but no, not anything beyond that. So your thoughts on how it all unfolded, and then now looking forward, what's this mean?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think this is how most bureaucracies work. And it's actually one of the things that I like about government, which is that put aside the elected people, the actual people doing the jobs, the people who are every day actually implementing the policies, are usually pretty dedicated public servants. So you've got like a deep bench of talent. So I'm glad that that is the way that this position is being backfilled, if only temporarily. And yes, it is a shame that sometimes the people who have that talent and expertise don't end up then becoming the political face of that organization or that department. So that, but I'm glad at least that she's there and that she's been there. So that's good. It's going to be interesting to see who ends up running for it because, it would be, my pick, if I had my druthers, who would I appoint? I'd point Preet Bharara. But
I knew you would go that direction.
I don't think he wants it. I don't know. He said he might, but I think he was a great federal prosecutor, and it was a shame to have lost him there. Now he's got a really excellent podcast, but he'd be a great attorney general. I'd have a lot of faith in what he would do because, again, he's another guy who had bipartisan respect and was doing a lot of what needed to be done. I don't know. We'll probably talk about it at some other point, so I don't want to get into the whole discussion about how these gubernatorial candidates are starting to talk about reconvening a Moreland Commission about campaign finance and other political officer ethics issues, because that I'm super excited about. But that is only going to be successful if you have a strong AG's office and a strong federal prosecutorial arm that will take the findings of a commission like that and actually do something. So we had that. We had that with Preet. After the Moreland Commission the last time, before Cuomo disbanded it. I think the Attorney General's office is really where it's at as far as cleaning some of this stuff up. So I hope it it goes well.
I'm split on this because the AG's office, before all of this became public and everybody knew what terrible things had happened, it seemed like the only office left that really had some respect attached to it.
Yes, yeah.
It seemed like our last line of defense before, everything went off the rails. We've got a really heated gubernatorial race, and it's just a primary race. It isn't even the actual race yet. And the race itself, I think, is going to be probably one of the most difficult for Governor Cuomo to get through that he has had in the last 2 runs. So my hope is that there is enough time for Underwood to properly clean up whatever messes were left behind. Because these sort of indiscretions in Schneiderman's personal life suggest that there were probably some compromised areas of his professional work. Just a blind assumption.
Right.
No idea.
Right.
But you kind of have to go in with that. That's got to be the situational awareness now, right?
Right.
Like maybe something is really screwed up here. So whoever comes in and is elected, hopefully can work from a true ground zero point and build from there and not have to dig out of the hole first. And, whether it's a man, whether it's a woman, hopefully they just have the right attitude of, being apolitical, being the things that the AG's office needs to be, especially in New York State.
It's an important office. I mean, I think no one should underestimate the Attorney General's office as really a force for good, from consumer protection to government accountability. I mean, it's a really critical office. So I'm hoping that we get someone who really, like you said, can approach it with a clean slate and actually rebuild that sense of integrity that I think that office has had.
And, make no mistake, obviously it is a political position in the sense that, once you are the Attorney General, you can segue into pretty much any political office you so choose. But from the outside, it seemed as though Schneiderman was at least cognizant enough to keep politics mostly at bay. And hopefully that part of it can continue with this office, because I think with as complicated as our two legislative chambers are, alone, there needs to be a really strong effort on the legal side to make sure that some positive change does come out of Albany eventually. But we do have some other topics, jumping right into maybe the most surprising news out of the last couple weeks, as far as true local news goes. The news that, Crestwood admitted that the salt caverns where they want to store LPG, not the best.
Yeah, I mean, not surprising news, but surprising admission, I guess, because I think everybody who's been following this issue has been saying for a long time that their assessment, that Crestwood's own assessment of the integrity of those caverns was incorrect, was inflated in their favor, in favor of them being able to handle all the pressure that they would subject those to. So, yeah, I mean, again, so not surprising that these facts are actually facts, being acknowledged as facts, but surprising that Crestwood is finally saying, yeah, I guess you got us on that one. Now, the question is, though, what's anybody going to do about it? I mean, going back to the governor, isn't this a place where the governor could say, we just put in this I Love New York thing on the lakefront in Geneva. We talk about protecting the Finger Lakes. Maybe we ought to say this project is inconsistent with those other investments. He could say that. He could do that, but I don't know. Well,
and to me, this all comes back to the whole, and obviously Cynthia Nixon was in Geneva not too long ago, and I think that was something that at one point we were going to talk about on the show, but it, just because of all the other news that happened, we didn't get around to it. The governor, seemed very reactive to her making the statement first on the incinerator in Romulus. So, and I believe she also shot down the Crestwood proposal in one fell swoop. Yeah. She just hit both of them. But she didn't focus on that one. She focused on the incinerator. So this seems like it would be a very good opportunity for the governor to pick up some of that political collateral back up off the ground that he lost through having to be the one who came in afterwards. Because when he released that statement inconspicuously on a Tuesday morning with no fanfare, no warning, no nothing, it felt secondary. Yeah,
it's a little political one-upsmanship, I think, is going on. Now, I don't mean to complain because the Finger Lakes are benefiting because of it, But I agree with you that it doesn't feel like the kind of sincere advocacy you would have hoped that you would get in relation to an issue like this.
Right.
Yes.
And maybe, if he were to come out, and it's already been years. No matter who comes forward now.
Right.
Y'all are late to the party.
We need Molinaro. I mean, we need him to say something because, frankly, he's sounding like a pretty good candidate. And I know, right? This is, I don't know.
There's the breaking news.
Augustine endorses Republican gubernatorial candidate. But, the thing is, he is an actual, fiscal conservative, and it sounds like potentially environmental conservative, which, the true Republican base, if you actually want to talk about Republican values, because I believe political parties, for whatever they're worth, must have some core values, right? He sounds like a back-to-basics Republican, and I've got no gripes about that. It's all this other stuff that's been going on with the Republicans lately that's been driving me crazy. But I'd be interested to hear what he says about this issue of environmental stewardship, particularly as it relates to the Finger Lakes.
Honestly, I think this would be something that he would probably, as soon as, and, I guess part of it might be timing. When do you make that announcement? When do you say something like that? Right now, I don't think he really has to, because he's pretty much got his primary wrapped up, because it's not really going to be one. So, I think part of this is Cuomo is saying this because Cynthia did, and you got this sort of you have an active race happening there. Republicans, our legislative Republicans at the state level have been pretty universally aligned on this one against it. I had Senator Molinaro on my podcast last week, and he called on circular energy to outright withdraw.
Yeah.
No questions asked. I think to me, that's interesting because it creates this universal playground where on this particular issue, and obviously this is just one issue, but everybody's aligned.
Yes.
Everybody's set on the same course and saying no. And maybe that's part of the reason why Molinaro hasn't come out and said anything yet, because it seems to be that, whether you say it or not, it's hard to find anybody, using the incinerator as an example.
Right.
It's hard to find anybody who supports it.
Yes.
I think we've publicly had one group, IBEW, out of Geneva, Local 840. I believe they were the only ones who publicly made any sort of public effort toward it, saying this is a good idea because of jobs or because, for whatever the reason may be. Other than that, locals, officials, elected officials, it seems to be universal. So to me, the timing is important. I think as summer goes on, you'll see a more concerted effort as Molinaro sort of... It's funny to me because maybe Molinaro is sitting back because he genuinely isn't sure who he's going to face.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Because I'll say this, the last time we did this show a month ago, I felt much less confident in the idea that Nixon could defeat Cuomo in a primary than I do now. I genuinely think there's been a bit of a move there. See,
I don't know.
It's still a long shot. I don't want to, I don't want to.
I don't want to say that I don't like either of them, but I will say that I have strong reservations about the candidacy of both. And it would be great. I would love it if former Syracuse Mayor Minor, if she ran, Mayor Minor, which I just think is a great phrase anyway, but she's so excellent, but I don't think at this point she's going to get into the race. So now I've got to figure out, if the candidate I thought was really perfect isn't going to be there, then who's the candidate I think that will be good? And I think they're actually going to have to say some real concrete things about what they will do.
Well, and I think Molinaro being in the race, I think he brings a level of substance that Nixon and Cuomo haven't had to deliver yet.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're racing against each other and they haven't had to have that head-to-head yet with the other major party player.
Right.
It could get really interesting, and this is going to be something that we're going to have to spend some actual time going over and breaking down.
Right.
But it opens up a really interesting dynamic, because I'll say this: you are not the first Democrat that I have heard actually say, Molinaro is somebody that I could see supporting, or I could see, being a sensible candidate for governor. It's a really interesting. There's so much time left.
Right.
It's so early still
that,
we're still in a stage where we still have to let the process play out.
Yes. But it's
Not
great
gonna have
that
ourselves.
Crestwood is now on record saying, hey, you people that we called crazy environmentalists,
Well,
guess what? You were right.
Sensibly, I think it kind of does put the permanent kill on the project.
I
think
so.
with them admitting it,
I hope so.
stifles that out. But another interesting topic.
Thank you for telling me about this one.
When I saw this yesterday, I was like, "Oh no, this is some really bizarre stuff." So I'm just going to summarize, because it was almost too petty to even really elaborate on. This council member wanted to video conference in.
Well, he was the supervisor.
He was the supervisor.
Yes,
he wanted to conference in.
Right.
The person who I'm going to assume, because I don't think the article was specific enough, the person who was serving as the deputy did not want to allow them to. And in turn, the supervisor sent a text message to the reporter who was covering the meeting and
said, hey, go tell them to answer their phones. I'm trying to call in.
which sparked an exchange that was done through the reporter.
All these texts. Yes.
The reporter is fielding text messages while covering a meeting from between the supervisor acting as an intermediary.
Right.
And this is just like, this is, as somebody who covers local board meetings, this is literally the most typical thing of, and I'm not saying that this sort of like back and forth happens, but this sort of bizarre expectation that a person who happens to go to all your meetings and covers your meetings is the right person to try and connect with.
Right.
While you're not getting what you want out of a situation that is at your own doing.
Yes.
I mean, this person obviously was out of town for a reason. If you wanted to be at the meeting, don't go out of town.
Right.
And it's just...
Well, I mean, and frankly, I do have to say, although it is funny, and although I got a kick out of it, so I'm not sad that it happened, from a perspective of like journalistic ethics, it's one thing to communicate with members of an elected body in order to get background and to get information. But really, you're not supposed to become part of the story when you're functioning as a journalist, right? I mean, this is why, thankfully, I'm not a journalist. I am simply, a columnist and a commentator. But so, for example, Dave Shaw used to come to all the city council meetings from the Finger Lakes Times, and now he covers Seneca County. If Dave Shaw were at a meeting and were communicating with city council saying, hey, so-and-so's out of town, wanted me to tell you this or this and this, while the meeting's going on, that wouldn't be appropriate. But to see the journalist put in this situation and then have to write a story about his own experience was really bizarre. And my read of the story was that they had expressed to the supervisor that he couldn't do this because the Open Meetings Law requires, and Geneva City Council, when we passed our Code of Ethics, we had a provision about teleconferencing, which didn't end up passing. They wanted to come back and revisit it. But it was based on kind of best practices. You do have to make some announcement that this is the way someone will be participating ahead of time. And it sounds from the article like the town board members simply texted back to the supervisor, hey, these are the rules, you didn't follow the rules, and you can't participate after the fact. Like, you can't push yourself into the meeting when you're not here. And he didn't like that.
I mean, so I agree. I'll jump in, though, on the journalistic integrity side of it. You're walking a really fine line there, because that is so absent of the fact that it's a meeting and and the supervisor is there by asking the reporter to ask questions. If an elected official of any kind sends me or any other reporter or anybody who's just doing news in general a text message or an email, no matter when, and says, I have X, Y, and Z concerns, your natural reaction as a journalist is going to be to ask questions.
Oh, I agree.
To
I agree.
basically call in that case, town council and say, hey, what's going on with this? And really, I look at it from the perspective of, how was he not to?
No, I agree
because that
with you.
becomes the story.
Yes, I agree with you that if he had just simply said, hey, is the supervisor trying to participate and you guys aren't letting him, that would be, and I know it sounds like a small distinction, but it really is. I mean, there really is a line there where it's one thing to be investigating a story. It's another thing to become part of the story by saying, hey, so-and-so just asked me to ask you this. Because then you are becoming you're becoming the microphone for that member of the legislative body. So he could have just said, like, hey, I'm getting a bunch of texts from the supervisor who says you guys aren't answering his calls and you're supposed to let him talk and he's trying to participate. What do you say about that? That's a journalistic inquiry, but him raising his hand and saying, the supervisor just asked me to tell you to please pick up your phone because he's trying to call you. And, is that... Yeah, I mean, that's different. I'm glad he did. Like I said, I'm glad he did it because otherwise we wouldn't have this to talk about. But technically, it's not his fault. It's the supervisor's fault for putting him in that position.
Right.
Like, the supervisor should not have used the journalist as a way of communicating with his own board. Like, that's not...
Right. And I think part of this is, and the reason why I defended it in that way is because when you're at a meeting... you look at the agenda, you have some vague idea of what your stories are going to be coming out of it, but you are going to walk away from a story when you are led down this golden path of just complete failure. Like it's nothing but mediocrity. It's crazy. Like, this is an opportunity for a story that I haven't seen a story like this ever, locally, ever.
Well, and kudos to the journalist, because did you see his kind of little snark at the end where he said, like, and the meeting was conducted in record time?
Yeah. It's really, really, it's bizarre. And it's something that I think if people only knew how much people in the news, especially in rural parts of the Finger Lakes, are relied on to be not just gatekeepers of facts and information, but also when you're looking at the very small publications, micro assistants to these legislative figures who don't really know. Frankly, I think most journalists are more in tune with what open meetings laws are, what the legislative process is in these small municipalities than the actual elected officials are themselves. Yes. I mean, how many times last year in the interviews we did leading up to our actual coverage of election night where, we heard candidates saying, well, I'm really looking forward to learning on the job about what this office is all about.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that explains it then.
But that's why the press is the fourth estate. That's why everybody's got to support their local media, because that is who keeps the government accountable. Like, if that journalist had not been there, people wouldn't know anything about this. So,
yeah, and another item in the weird, Tom Golisano. Tom Golisano's Geese.
Oh, I like your headline. That's
that was as good as I could do. So he finally had his opportunity. He hasn't been paying his school taxes. I think something like some unfathomable amount of money. He's a billionaire.
Right.
He could just pay it and just be done with it, forget about it, move on.
Right.
But no, we're here. He is appealing. He created this website and business and around like helping property owners learn about their tax rights and whatever. What's your read on this situation?
Well, first, I think at my house I've been playing the world's tiniest violin for Mr. Golisano, and it's amazing because you read the articles about it, and then you read the comments, and people are like, "Oh, this man, he donates so much money. We should give him a break." And I'm thinking, wait a second. Do you know what you're saying? You're saying that somebody who has a very successful business, who also chooses to be charitable, is therefore entitled to not contribute to the community in the way that everybody is minimally required through taxes, because he has Canada geese on his yard that he has determined it is the municipality's responsibility to deal with. As though the municipality put a lake with a shoreline as an attractive nuisance along his property, and that somehow that has devalued it. I mean, he has how many feet of frontage? I find it interesting that this has become, in his mind, the community's problem, and moreover, he thinks it is indicative of the tax problem in general. And in my view, I can't find a situation more out of touch with the everyday common man's experience of taxation in New York State than this. If all of us had the luxury to be worried about our taxes based on the presence of geese instead of issues of services, resale value, I mean, he's not been denied any service. His property is in a prime location. He doesn't have any of the things that the rest of us have to worry about when we talk about the taxes being too high. So, yeah, he's getting no love from me on this, as you can see.
Me either. I find it kind of funny because this is one of those scenarios where if you do your research and you talk to people who live near bodies of water, own businesses near bodies of water, who have problems like this every year. They don't not pay their taxes.
Right.
They don't go to their local town board and complain about how the geese are just taking over. There are ways to have it handled.
Yeah.
To deal with it.
They buy those little fake owls and put them around.
And it just goes to this entire idea because I saw a lot of those comments too that you were referring to. They would never, ever say, these people would never say that if the circumstances were even slightly different or if the name were just different.
Right.
Never. They would never say, well, this person's donated so much money, we should just give them a pass.
And they would
give them a pass on what, though?
Yeah.
Because he's complaining about the thing. Like, he's complaining about the birds. He's not complaining about his tax.
Right.
Like, if you look at the bones of his argument, it's that, if these geese are gone, I pay happily and everything's fine. He's not saying his assessment's wrong. He's not saying He's saying, I have a problem with birds and I don't know what to do or I don't want to do it.
And let me tell you something. Geneva has had a crow situation, right? Let me tell you.
Like Auburn.
If a low-income homeowner on North Exchange Street came to City Council or the Board of Assessment Review and filed a grievance saying, I'm not going to pay my property taxes because the crows are pooping all over my land, people would be outraged. They would say, who does this person think they are that they're not going to pay their taxes? Yep. But if a wealthy guy has some geese on his lakefront property, his pristine shoreline, all of a sudden we have sympathy for that? I don't get it. It is such a double standard. I mean, this was like my column a while ago that talked about people who get so angry about welfare abuse but have no problem with corporate welfare, which actually costs them so much more money and has nothing to do with people being able to live and everything to do with people making a huge profit. People's inconsistencies kind of blow my mind. Yeah.
We could probably dedicate an entire show to that, honestly. Okay, so stories of the week. What are you watching?
Oh my goodness. I wasn't prepared for this.
Allow me then.
Oh yes, please. What are you watching?
RG&E and NYSEG, they were ordered to pay something like $3.9 million to settle for the windstorm that they were ill prepared for. Weather is a really wicked and wild thing. Really tough to prepare for weather. You have no idea. And I've talked to people who work not just for NYSEG, but for companies who do that sort of utility pole work in general. It is very hard when you're talking about a infrastructure that's at that scale. It is not as simple as just, well, if you had more trucks, if you had more people, you would have been able to handle it better. No. There is essentially an expectation of, if this much is down or if this many people are out, it is minimally going to take this long to get it back up and running, because this is the method we use. I would have much rather seen, instead of a $3.9 million fine, I would have liked to have seen a $3.9 million contribution to some sort of pool that could eventually be used to move all of our power lines and all of our wired infrastructure underground.
Yes.
Just my 2 cents.
Yeah,
because
underground utilities would be amazing. I mean, that is, new communities are built that way for a reason, because it has been shown that actually cuts down costs in the long run.
New communities, I just want to point out, there are at least 3 different neighborhoods in Seneca Falls alone that were primarily built in the mid to late 80s, early 90s that are that way.
Yeah, it should be.
It's been around for a long time.
Right.
We need no more excuses. When wires go down, when poles go down, we should be putting them underground immediately.
I agree with
without even replacing the poles as they stand.
Right.
Maybe it'll cost a little more, but that would be a great way to invest our money instead of continuing to work off of what is now a flawed and outdated technology.
Right. Okay, what am I watching? I am watching the impact and effect of the implicit bias training that's been going on in the city of Geneva for the police department, and the recommendations that came out of the kind of consultant's advisory report with regard to a police accountability board. It was weird because that was very strongly recommended by the consultant, yet when city councilors were giving their recap of the meeting, they didn't mention that piece. They talked about an ombudsman, someone who would help people file complaints, but they didn't actually talk about the review board, which has been a key piece. And the city of Rochester is currently moving that way and has had some really good research and discussion about how that is critical for not just protecting the public, but also protecting the officers. And I think people need to understand that accountability is in everybody's best interest. Like, this isn't an effort to get the police department. It isn't an effort to bypass public input. It is actually an accountability measure that serves everybody well, that serves the community really well. So I think the city council hasn't really wanted to take it on because I think police and public safety issues, they always feel are better to just avoid because it's complicated and politically they're worried about saying the wrong thing. But the fact of the matter is it actually is a protective measure that just increases community trust. It's a win for everybody. So I'm looking to see how they will deal with that.
All right, well, we survived another week.
Yes.
Isn't that awesome? 2 things I do want to just briefly touch on. New redesigned app for Finger Lakes One. Check it out, iOS, Android, the whole 9 yards. We did not answer your questions this week, but hey, we will be.
Yes.
Keep sending them. We've got a few questions built up from the last month. We'll actually probably tackle more questions in the next episode than we normally do to get us caught back up. But wanted to get those 2 things in. We'll be back in a couple weeks. It won't be a month like last time. Don't worry. It's summer. We know everybody is available, and we're here to do this. But that will do it for this week's show. Thanks for our listeners and FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Let us know what's on your mind. Drop us a line at debrief@FingerLakes1.com. For Jackie Augustine, I'm Josh Durso. Stay informed, Finger Lakes, and we'll catch you next time.